The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
I'm going to be talking about some of the scientific evidence that has been gathered in the research of paranormal phenomena. That covers a very broad area. But given that I only have an hour tonight, I'm going to narrow it down, and I'm going to be talking about the research of one man, Rupert Sheldrake. By the way, raise your hand if you're familiar with Rupert Sheldrake. Okay, about half of you. Great. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Sheldrake, he's a British biologist. He's been doing this type of research for some 30 years. He has a PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge University. He was a research fellow of the Royal Society, and he is the author of some 60 published papers and books. Regarding paranormal experiences, that's sort of a broad term, I would not be surprised that some of you in this audience, and perhaps some of you watching the webcast, have had from time to time something that might fall in that category. Things such as telepathic communications, premonitions, and things of that sort. Because these things are really quite common. They really are. But as Richard suggested, conventional science, they're not really interested in exploring these kinds of phenomena. In fact, Rupert Sheldrake says that institutional biologists in particular, they frown upon this type of work. And they often ridicule and denigrate those who do. Sheldrake knows because he's been on the receiving end of a lot of their nasty comments. They actually have vigilante groups of scientists on the internet that go out to try to attack him and say things and do things to denigrate his reputation. But he takes it all in stride, and when people have constructive criticism, he incorporates it into his test procedures and he tightens up the parameters because sometimes critics do have valid objections. So he just uses that information to make a better experiment. Why is that? I'm not going to go into the reasons why too much, except to pass on what Sheldrake suggests is that this type of research doesn't really fit into their mechanistic model of how the universe works. And I might add that there are definitely career risks attached to doing this kind of research. If you really get into this in a big way and you're an up-and-coming scientist, you might want to forget about getting grants. You might have a real hard time getting your papers published in peer-reviewed journals, and you might be waiting a long time for promotions. Now, the term paranormal, the prefix para, simply means beyond. Paranormal, beyond the normal. But Sheldrake suggests that the only reason we use that term is because these type of happenings don't fit into the scientific model. You have to realize that the mechanistic view of the universe, despite what's happening in theoretical particle physics, the great majority of scientists don't allow in their model for things such as telepathy, precognition, or even the very common experience, which we'll talk about later, what Sheldrake has called the sense of being stared at. We'll talk about that later. No, rather than examining the evidence and facts in a straightforward manner, some scientists would rather attack the messenger and destroy his reputation. That's a fact. Now, I think you'll agree with me that such attitudes are more appropriate for zealots and bigots than purportedly objective scientists. And I would suggest that cynics would do well to remember the words of St. Augustine. St. Augustine said this: "There are no such things as miracles which violate the laws of nature. There are only events which violate our limited understanding of nature." You know what? Madame Blavatsky, she agrees with that. In the Key to Theosophy, she says, quote, "A miracle is supposed to mean some operation which is supernatural, whereas there is really nothing above or beyond the laws of nature. End of quote. Incidentally, she felt quite strongly that theosophists should oppose bigotry in every form, whether religious, social, or, yes, even scientific. That may come as a shock to some people that there can be such a thing as scientific bigotry. But believe me, it does exist. All right, here's what we can expect from tonight's talk. The title of the talk is Experiments in Telepathy, and it just occurred to me this afternoon that that title could be a little misleading. So let me clarify. We're not going to be doing any experiments here tonight, so I'm sorry if you were hoping for that. But what I will be doing is sharing with you a few of the very fascinating case studies that Sheldrake has compiled over the last 25, 30 years. And I will describe a few of the experiments that he's done, including one very simple experiment that you, with a few people, could do. Doesn't cost anything. You could get a study group, perhaps a Theosophical study group with 5 or 10 people. We'll get to that towards the end of the talk, but you could try that out. Run the test for yourself, see what happens. All right, before I get any further, I should say that when I was putting this talk together, I was going through the books of Sheldrake, looking at some of his videos. He really has a lot of material. And I had to decide how much can I include in this talk. So I recalled the wise words of the sage Walt Disney. Walt Disney once said, "Always leave them wanting more." So hey, it's been great. You guys have been a super audience. I'm out of here. No? No. Oh, it was worth a try. All right. On the other hand, I don't want to overload you with information, or I could find myself in the position of 2 young men who went to visit a painter some years ago in England. This is a true story. These 2 guests had been invited to have tea with the painter Walter Sickert, and they had really overstayed their welcome. Okay, when the time came for them to finally leave, they got up, and the painter said quite nonchalantly, "And do come back, old chaps, when you've a little less time to spare." So I don't want you doing that to me. All right. In a recent book published by Quest Books, I'll hold it up here, this is called A New Science of the Paranormal, written by Lawrence LeShan. And in that book, this was published last year, Lawrence LeShan describes basically 2 types of research that are done in this area, or what he calls PSI for short. The first category are spontaneous happenings out in the field. This would be things like deathbed apparitions, instances of precognition. You can't control these. They just happen wherever it is. You can't force these things to happen in a laboratory. Okay, that's one category. The second category includes all those tests that are actually done in a laboratory according to the scientific method. Or, if not a laboratory, they're done somewhere, but under strictly controlled conditions, and more importantly, the test can be repeated. And again, I'm going to invite some of you at the end of this lecture, try that simple experiment that I'll give you. All right, before we go into Sheldrake's work, let's go back in time, a little history lesson. In the past century, one of the groundbreaking scientists, a lot of you may know his name, he did research in this area. His name was Professor Rhine, J.B. Rhine at Duke University, North Carolina. He actually coined the term parapsychology. Why parapsychology? Because previous research had been done sort of in a sloppy manner. And he wanted to distinguish his research going according to strict scientific methods so it would be given credibility and accepted in the scientific community. So from the period of, let's say, the late 1920s to about 1965, that's roughly 35 years, he conducted literally hundreds of thousands of experiments trying to determine if ESP existed. I'll just give you one experiment that he did quite a bit of. He used a special pack of cards, Zener cards is what he called them. He invented this. It's not rocket science. Basically, you have a deck of cards with 5 different symbols, a square, a circle, a triangle, a star, and a wavy line. And you can duplicate those cards and shuffle them. But basically 5 symbols. Okay, so the cards were shuffled by hand or by machine. And during the test, you had a subject who would sit in a chair in the lab, probably was blindfolded. Behind the subject who was blindfolded, you had a person who would look at the cards, pick them off the deck one at a time, stare at the card for 10, 15 seconds, concentrating on the symbol. And the person in front would try to guess what that symbol was. It's a star, it's a triangle, whatever. Now, you can do the math, 5 symbols. Just by pure chance, you have what, the odds are 1 out of 5, you're gonna get it right 1 out of 5 times. And so if you do this test 50, 60, 100 times, you're probably gonna have a 20% accuracy rate on average. Well, he did this, again, many thousands, tens of thousands, and the average correct number of guesses was 21%. It's above chance level. It's statistically relevant, but, not terribly exciting, right? It's not going to set the world on fire. Well, that's typical of some of the experiments done in the past. These were done between total strangers. The subject did not know the person looking at the card, done in a clinical setting. Well, the genius of Sheldrake is that he came up with a whole new style of experimentation. I'll get into that. And as I said, he's compiled thousands of case histories, and he's conducted many, many experiments. Now, both are important. The experiments are controlled. The case histories, that's evidence too. May not be proof, but you look at all the evidence added up, and it counts for something. I might add that if you like to investigate this further, you can go to his website, sheldrake.org, O-R-G, and he does talk about some of the experiments that he's done, and he lists his books that you can get. All right, right now I'd like to talk about strange behavior on the part of canines. You know what canines are. So you could say this is the part of the lecture where my talk goes to the dogs. All right. Some people that have had dogs sometimes ask themselves, wow, does this dog have a sixth sense? Let me just see in the audience here. Raise your hand if you have ever owned a dog or you now own a dog. I'll raise my hand because I've had dogs almost all my life. Quite a few of you. All right, put your hands down. Now, those of you who raised your hand said I did own a dog or do own a dog, how many of you at one time or another were convinced that your dog could sense that you were coming home before you actually arrived? Now, the only way you would know is if somebody else was at home and said, Sparky really started wagging his tail and barking about 5 minutes before you walked through the door. Has anybody ever had that happen? A few, not as many. All right. That's good. There's another book that I'd like to point out to you by Sheldrake, published in 1999. This is a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. And there's no truth to the rumor that there's a sequel, Wives That Wish They Knew When Their Husbands Are Coming Home. There's no truth to that at all. All right, in this book, it's a softcover book, very interesting book, he says, and I'm going to quote him from the preface. This is Rupert Sheldrake speaking. I've collected more than 500 reports of dogs that know when their owners are coming home. Some wait at the door or window for 10 minutes or more in advance. Others go out and meet their owner in the street or at a bus stop. Some scientists say this is due to mere routine or the canine's sharp sense of smell or hearing. But case after case shows that no such simple explanation suffices. All right, illustrate it with an example. Very often a person who owns a dog will call home, talk to somebody in the family, the wife, the spouse, the children, and say, hey, I'm on my way home. Now, in those cases, if the dog picks up on it, the skeptics might suggest that, no, the dog is just picking up on the anticipation of the spouse or the person at home, noticing a little excitement. That's actually a good, valid objection, but it can be tested. That can be measured. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of just 2 or 3 interesting anecdotes because it's important you hear this evidence, the type of stories. Now, each one is not conclusive, but again, if you add up, you get dozens, hundreds of these. You have to take this seriously, I think. The first case history is from a mother and wife living in Suffolk, Virginia. Her husband was in the United States Coast Guard. And the family dog, Jackson, often went to the front door or out to the street at the time the children would come home from school. You say, oh, that's just conditioning, it's routine. Okay, fair enough, that could be. It could be nothing more than conditioning. But here's the kicker. Her husband, in the Coast Guard, he's out on the sea. She never knows exactly when he's going to come home. And when the boat docks, that's 20-some miles away. There's no way the dog could sense that or hear it, no matter how sharp a sense of smell or hearing he has. Now, at this point, I'm going to give it to you in her words. This is Mrs. Preston talking about the dog and her husband coming home at unexpected times. He would arrive home at odd hours. When the ship had come into port, Jackson, that's a dog, would get excited, go to the door and want out. Most of the time, he would go and sit at the end of the sidewalk, stationing himself to look in the direction that he knew the car would travel. He got so good at this, I couldn't help but notice. Now, here's a funny part. And sometimes I would use Jackson's warning to freshen my hair or do my makeup before my husband arrived home. If I was cooking dinner and was at the point of deciding how many portions to cook, I would take his cue and act accordingly. A similar story comes from a young woman working in a hospital in England. This lady had a husband. They had 2 dogs. Now, she worked flex time. That means your hours are not regular. Some days you might come home at one time. Next day it might be a little bit later. So it was very irregular. Well, the funny thing was that every time she came home, her husband had a hot tea waiting for her. It hadn't been sitting there. It was just freshly brewed tea. She says, how does he do it? Well, they figured it out that at the exact time that she was leaving the ward of the hospital, which is about a 10, 15-minute drive, the dogs would start wagging their tails and go up to the bay windows and start, acting in anticipation of her arrival. So the husband took that as a cue and he got the tea kettle up on the stove. Sheldrake literally has dozens, if not hundreds, of stories like this on file. What I found interesting is that this type of behavior is more common in dogs than cats. Wonder why that might be. Anybody dare to speculate?
Cats are stubborn.
Cats are stubborn. Dogs are pack animals. Well, that may be, but whatever the reason, it seems to be more common. Now, that's not to say cats don't do it. They just don't do it as often. There's less incidents on file of cats showing this kind of behavior. All right, now, people normally arrive home on foot or by car, But here's something. What about dog owners that arrive home by plane? All right, here's the situation. Back in World War II, in the Air Force, the Royal Air Force allowed certain officers to keep dogs on the air base. And very often, at least in this particular case, one of the officers who was a pilot would take off And the other officers stationed on the ground would notice that shortly before he landed, the dog would run out to the runway and await his master. And so they thought this was very interesting. And they started watching this to see if it would happen, how often it would happen. Now, I'm going to just read you what one of the officers on the ground, this is not the dog's owner, but this is another guy, puzzled, and this is what he said. The dog in question was another Labrador who reacted to the return of his owner, an officer in the Royal Air Force. Quote, he watched his master fly away in a plane and then settled down to wait. When the same plane returned, the dog didn't get up. The men all thought that the dog had failed, but they were wrong and the dog was right. See what happened there? The men, the officers, recognized his plane coming in, and they said, oh, the dog really messed up. He's still laying there. Well, guess what? When the plane landed, it was another pilot. Apparently, he had pulled a switcheroo at another base, and he came back another 20, 30 minutes later in a different plane from the other end of the runway. And, of course, nobody could have known that, except maybe the control tower, but the dog knew it before the plane even touched the ground. Now, how does he do it? How do they do it? These are the kinds of questions that Sheldrake is trying to dig into. Okay, you can say that anecdotal evidence isn't really too supportive, or you can't really trust it. And okay, Sheldrake will probably agree with that to some extent. And he does say in his book that researchers, like himself, they do need to be skeptical. You have to exercise some healthy skepticism. You need to ask questions. And above all, you have to realize that, hey, people can be mistaken. You know, memory plays tricks. But he says that being skeptical is one thing. Being cynical, that's a totally different thing. You see, cynics, they dismiss all such evidence out of hand. They totally dismiss it, don't even want to look at it. And they take a rather dogmatic attitude, which presents a barrier to open-minded inquiry. And I think it's very unfortunate that so many so-called scientists are some of the first ones to adopt this attitude. All right, let's take a look at another situation that Sheldrake investigated. He talked to owners of dog kennels throughout the United States and throughout Britain, talked to very many of them. And basically he asked them, do you ever notice any odd behavior on the part of the dog on the day that the owner comes to pick them up? Now some said no, but a significant number, I forget the percentage, 45, 50% said, yes, I do. And they had comments like this, quote, they get more alert. Or, quote, there is an air of expectancy. Or, some of them act different on the day they are going home. All right, again, the skeptic might, because you have to look at flaws in the experiment. You have to look at flaws in the data. And somebody might say, well, okay, maybe the dog did act different, but perhaps the kennel worker did something different to tip the dog off. You know, maybe the kennel worker was grooming the dog, making sure he looked real spiffy before the owner came. Okay, that's possible. But just as people sometimes come home unexpectedly early and the dog senses it, same thing can happen at a dog kennel. You know, a guy can leave his dog at the kennel and tell the guy, I'll be back on Saturday. Well, maybe his business trip ended early, he gets home on Friday, picks the dog up a day early. Somehow the dog may still sense that. Now, throughout all this, what is very important is the emotional bond. Sheldrake has concluded that the strong emotional bond between dogs and man, that's very important in facilitating this process. Cats, by comparison, we talked about them, they're generally a little less sociable and more independent than dogs. You know, sometimes they'll rub up your leg and purr, and you know, then other times they say, not now, I have a headache, you know, come back later. So cats are a little finicky. Dogs, they're always very loyal. That's why they call it man's best friend, I think. So this emotional attachment apparently facilitates this process. Now, one other little interesting statistic of dog owners that have, families, children, and so forth living in the same home or apartment, most of these dogs, 78%, that's 4 out of 5, exhibit this behavior only with one person. The rest of the family, nothing. A much smaller percentage, 17%, that's 1 out of 5, they might react that way with 2 people. And very, very few exhibit that behavior with more than 2. So primarily it's a bond between one dog and one person. Now, this emotional bond is also important, Sheldrake says, between people. You see, this is a problem of the research that Professor Ryan did at Duke University. Remember I said he had 5 cards? Just guessing, you got a 20% chance of being right over the long run. He ended up, after doing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of tests, 21%. Yeah, it's interesting. It's not going to shake the scientific community to its foundations. They might just say it's an aberration, an anomaly or something. Well, it works much better, Sheldrake found, when people know each other, when they have a close social or emotional bond. People from the same family, lovers, husbands and wives. It doesn't work too well between complete strangers. And that's what Ryan did. He used complete strangers in his test. Well, except for Sheldrake, virtually no research has been done in this area. As I said, he's a groundbreaking scientist in this area. Now, I'll give you an example. We talked about anecdotal evidence, and you can question the accuracy of it and so forth, but Sheldrake actually has put this on video. And he has a test which appears on a video. We have in our library, by the way. The tape is called 7 Experiments That Could Change the World. Let me describe this part of the tape. Sheldrake uses 2 cameras. Okay, there's a family, a young lady living with her mother. They have a dog. One camera person stays in the home, puts the camera up on a tripod, and watches the dog. And the other camera is a handheld camera. The other researcher follows the young lady as she goes into town about 25 miles away to do shopping and get a little bite to eat, la-di-da. Also, the cameras are synchronized in terms of time setting. So when you're watching this on the video, it's a split screen. On one side of the screen, you have the camera at home, watching pretty much focused on the dog. What is the dog doing? The mother's reading a book or newspaper, and he's basically sitting at her feet, just snoozing, not really doing much. And you see this. The other screen, you see the woman going from store to store, going to the boutiques, going to lunch. And again, the time are synchronized. You see the clock and the seconds ticking away. And this is the very dramatic part. After a couple of hours, and this was not a predetermined time, the lady, the dog owner, says, "Hey, I think I'm ready to go back home." All right. Almost within 3 or 4 seconds, the dog, who had been just sort of snoozing there, first thing is his ears perk up, and he lifts up his head, and he gets up on his 4 legs, does a little stretch, and then he walks over to the big picture window that they have about 10 feet away from the Easy Boy chair that the mother was sitting in. This is all happening, the dog, as she walks to her car to go home with the other camera person. The dog didn't know. The mother didn't know when she was coming home. She didn't even know. She just decided that spontaneously, "Hey, I think I'm going to go home now." How did the dog pick up on it? How do he do that? Let's look at another type of situation. We've talked about an emotional bond, a positive link between owner and pet. How about negative links? Okay, again, let's see. Dog owners, please raise your hand again. If you're on the internet, don't worry, you don't have to raise your hand. I can't see you. Now, of those put your hands up now, and of those whose dog really enjoy going to the vet, keep your hand up. Very few. My dog hated going. I literally had to force him into the car. He did not like going to the vet. Why? I don't know why. I don't know why. Well, this is a case of a lady who had a Springer Spaniel. She lived in England. Now, the visitor was her son-in-law. He was a veterinarian. Okay, the dog belonged to the mother-in-law, but the son-in-law used to visit her to help out around the house and just to come over and chat. Now, this I have to read from you. This is the story that the veterinarian shared with Sheldrake. This is the vet speaking. The dog used to know whether I was visiting socially or whether I was visiting as a vet. She would be all over me and whooping with delight if I was visiting socially. But if I visited as a vet, she was hiding behind the boiler. There was nothing I could see which would give her a clue that I was visiting as a vet. You see, he didn't wear his uniform, he just came in his casual civilian clothes. But anyway, she would have had to make the decision to hide before I got into the house. She got it right every single time. And I used to visit quite often. I'd pop in and do all sorts of things. Although as a vet, I'd very seldom visit. And it wasn't just because the dog was sick. I'd just come over for routine things. But the dog knew when I was on duty and when I wasn't. How does he do it? How do they do it? All right, if you didn't like this first part of the talk up until now, this next part is really for the birds, because we're going to talk about homing pigeons. This is another mystery that science really hasn't been able to unravel. In fact, migratory birds in general, how do they travel thousands of miles and find their way back? You know, they reach a destination, they come back, sometimes to the same tree. They've done research on this. They've researched homing pigeons for, Sheldrake says, 100 years. But for all that effort, nobody can come up with a definitive answer. Yeah, they've had various theories put forth. None of them hold water, though. When they're tested, they find a flaw with it. All right, the very first theory about homing pigeons, actually this was in terms of birds in general that migrate, it was posed by good old Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin suggested that, hey, birds remember the landmarks of the journey. You know, the trees, the rivers, the lakes, the mountains, etc. Well, you can test that theory. You know how they tested that theory? You put the birds in a rotating container. You put that rotating container inside a van that has no windows. They cannot see outside. The fact that the container is rotating sort of disorients their sense of direction. You drive that van however many miles you want to go. Every single time they've done it, the pigeons find their way home. How do they do it? So much for Chuck's theory, Charles Darwin. Another theory that has been refuted is that pigeons are guided home by their sense of smell. Now you may think this is a little cruel, but some researchers have actually tested this theory by putting paraffin, wax, inside the bird's nostrils. They take them out X number of miles. Sure enough, the birds arrive home without problem. I'm sure they take the wax out afterwards. Okay, there's a number of other theories. I'm not going to go into each one. I'll just mention them. Some say it's due to the sun. Some say it's due to the stars. They navigate by the stars. And others say it's the Earth's magnetic field. That sounds interesting, right? The Earth's magnetic field. You know what Sheldrake did? He actually put a little magnet, attached it to the bird's head to interrupt that magnetic flow. You know, basically it neutralizes any magnetic field. They still find their way home in every case. If you find this interesting, you can buy this book or order it on Amazon or in your local bookstore, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. And the subtitle is, And Other Unexplained Powers of Animals. It's not only dogs that exhibit this type of behavior, but horses, cats, even parrots. So a lot of interesting reading in that book. I'm going to mention just one experiment done with pigeons. because it's so very interesting. All right, we all take it for granted that pigeons can find their way home. Hey, no surprise there, we know that. We take that for granted. But, and here's the genius of Sheldrake, what if you moved the home? Could they find it? Well, how would you do that? Well, what if the home was a mobile pigeon loft? They had these in Britain during World War I and II. They were used by the military. They're basically big cages on wheels, and the military used them in North Africa and other places. But they still have a number of these mobile pigeon lofts in Britain, but they're generally just sitting in one spot in a farmer's yard or something. They're stationary. So Sheldrake approached a man who had a mobile pigeon loft, said, I'd like to do this experiment. Fine. So here's the way it works. They take all the pigeons out of the loft, put them into a big pigeon basket. And this test is about 10 or 12 pigeons. By the way, you can see this on that video I mentioned earlier, 7 experiments that could change the world. Then the farmer hooks up a tractor and pulls that pigeon loft down the road, maybe 100 yards or so. What has happened in the experiments, when the pigeons are released out of that cage, they're going, hey, where's my house? Where is it? They don't know. They're a little bit disoriented. I mean, think about it. If you came home and your house had moved, your neighbor's house is there, but your house is gone, you'd be a little bit disoriented too. So they flew in a circle a little bit in the air. They came back down, a little bit flustered. He said it took about a half hour, and they finally found it. They could have easily seen it when they were flying around in a circle about 25, 30 feet in the air. It was definitely visible, but it took them a little while. Now, he continued to do this experiment over and over, each time first 100 yards away, then 150, and eventually he moved it as far as maybe 1 or 2 miles away. There was one test he described in the video. They had a mobile pigeon loft in Holland near a small town. Okay, they took the birds out, put them in a cage. They drove the pigeon loft to the other side of town, a couple miles away. Now, when they released the birds, they did the same thing. They're a little, whoa, what's happening? They get up in the air, they're looking. There's no way you could see that pigeon loft on the other side of town because you had tall buildings. There's no direct line of vision. It took them about 25, 30, 40 minutes, but they found it. How do they do it? So, I'm going to switch gears at this point, and we're going to refer to some of the experiments done in a more recent book. And this is a book published in 2003 by Sheldrake, and it's called The Sense of Being Stared At and Other Aspects of the Extended Mind. Now, I'm going to ask you again, how many of you have ever had the experience of watching somebody, and all of a sudden that person turns around and looks right at you? You know? Oh yeah, raise your hand. Let's just oh wow, more than half. Could be chance, right? Could be just coincidence. But here's one thing I find puzzling. For some reason this happens, women seem to experience this more than guys. Women seem to find guys staring at them. I don't know if somebody can explain that to me. I'm not getting it why that is so, but so anyway, Sheldrake in this book has about 15 years of tests and anecdotal evidence. I'm going to give you a few little excerpts from the book, and I quote, "In the Second World War, Royal Air Force pilots, fighter pilots, they were advised not to stare at an enemy pilot before preparing to shoot him down. The intensity of the gaze had been known to make the enemy pilot look straight around at the attacker." Now tell me something. World War II, it's about 60-some years ago. If the military takes this thing seriously, to the point where they instruct their pilots, don't stare at the guy you're going to shoot down, why do not conventional scientists take this stuff seriously? Now, another one is that he found another aspect of this is that the sense of staring is very directional. People not only turn around because they feel somebody's looking at them, but they actually, in many cases, can zero right in on the spot where it's coming from. And here's an example that Sheldrake shares. He used to travel a lot, and like most guys, he used to look at pretty young women. And he says, from time to time, I found that when I look at people from behind, they turn around and look at me. The most striking instances have occurred when I've looked out of upstairs windows, and people have not only turned around, but looked up. In one case, I was attending a conference in Dusseldorf, Germany. I was looking out of my 7th floor hotel window at 2 women. They were walking on a path below when one of them stopped, looked up directly at me. Okay, here's another one from a professional photographer for a tabloid. Wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. From a photographer at a tabloid. We'll strike the professional part. Now this is his words to Sheldrake. Or rather, this is Sheldrake describing it. One long lens photographer, that's a guy that used telescopic lens, can photograph people from a long distance. He worked for The Sun, one of the more popular tabloids in Britain. He said that he was amazed by how many times people whose picture he was about to take would turn around and look right down the lens, even if they were looking in the opposite direction to begin with. He didn't think they could see him or detect his movements. He said, and now I'm quoting the photographer, "I'm talking about taking pictures at distances of up to half a mile away, in situations where it is quite impossible for people to see me, although I can see them. They are so aware, it's just uncanny." That's from a guy that does this for a living, you know, a paparazzi type, except from a distance. Now, Sheldrake, as I said, has plenty of critics, and there are plenty of skeptics just towards this whole area. And basically, their arguments boil down to 3 things. I'll just enumerate those real quickly. One is that it's nothing but superstition. Second is that people are not really reacting to a gaze or a stare, but what it really is, they say, is they're reacting to sounds or movements in the peripheral field of vision. And the third argument is that, no, this is just blind chance or selective memory. Selective memory meaning you remember the times you turned around and somebody was staring at you, but you forget, the other times where nobody was there. Sheldrake says that the last 2 arguments, peripheral movements, blind chance, or selective memory, he says those have some merit, and they need to be considered when you construct your test to rule those factors out. As far as the first argument, that it's superstition, that's not an argument. That's just plain old prejudice. That's not an argument at all. So, to repeat an earlier point, Sheldrake says that there's been a definite taboo in the scientific community for a long time against doing this kind of research. And to prove his point, for a period of 100 years, from 1890 to 1990, 100 years, guess how many research papers were published in the scientific community on this sense of being stared at? Just take a guess. 0? No, there were some published. Take a stab at it. 5, pretty close. 4. And you know what? It really wasn't 4 because 2 of those 4 were translations. So really, in 100 years, he had 2 papers published on this. Something that many people, millions of people have had this experience, but no scientist is curious enough or maybe courageous enough to put their reputation on the line and do research into this field. Well, here are the basic 3 groupings or 3 types of experiments that Sheldrake does. And I'll go through these really quick. The first one can be done by a group of people. It doesn't really cost anything. You have a subject, sits with their back to the observer. You can have actually more than 1 observer. You can have 4 or 5, or just 1 observer. And then you have to have the person that controls it. What happens is the person in back either stares at the subject or looks away, literally turns around, or not turning because you don't want to make any movement with your feet, but you just turn your head, looking away, staring at the subject. Now what determines that? Sheldrake, or whoever it is, just flips a coin. Heads, you look; tails, you look away. So the subject has no idea whether the person's going to look at them or look away. And then there's a little mechanical clicker to signal to the subject that the test is on. Make your guess. Subject says, looking, or not looking. Okay, you do that over and over, and you tabulate. The person controlling it tabulates. You might do that 50 to 100 times. All right, if there was nothing to this whole thing and a person was just guessing, you'd be right at least how many times, percentage-wise? 50%. Absolutely. 1 out of 2, you got a 50% chance of being right. You want to know what percentage Sheldrake got on this? Before you guess, let me remind you, J.B. Ryan with those 5 cards, he got 21, 1% above chance level. Okay, with Sheldrake's experiment, it's a 50% his chance level. He got in the low 60s. That's huge. That's huge. Okay, you can also do the second type variation of this experiment is you have the subject in a room all by him or herself. And the controller and the lookers, they're in another room. And they're looking through closed circuit television. And that yielded very similar results. Let me digress for a second. In his book, Sheldrake spoke to store detectives throughout London and some of the bigger cities and asked them, when you're looking at doing surveillance, looking at people through cameras, do you ever get the sense that somehow they know that they're being looked at? Now, a lot of guys, no. But keep in mind that the kind of person who would do a store detective, a lot of these are retired detectives. They're very hard-boiled people. They've been around criminals, and they're tough birds. They're not new age, airy-fairy type of people. And a lot of them said, yeah. In fact, one guy, a store detective in a big department store in London, says to Sheldrake, I was looking at these 2 women in the store, and they were pilfering stuff, sticking it inside their coat, and all of a sudden they stopped, and they were looking around. Now, there was nobody in the aisle to indicate that they were being watched. And he says they couldn't see the cameras were hidden, but he was watching them through the hidden cameras. And they looked around, they said, whoops. They started putting the merchandise back on the shelf, and they hightailed it out of the store. Coincidence? Perhaps. I think there's more to it than that, though. All right, and then the last type of experiment. Okay, the first one is the observer and the subject are in the same room. The second one is they're in separate rooms with closed circuit television. The last type of test that he describes in the book are real life situations where the observers are looking through a one-way mirror or a darkened glass window, and they're looking at people in a shopping mall or on the street, and come up with some very striking results there. Now, he also talks about something called telephone telepathy. All right, let me ask you, I'm sure some of you have had this experience. How many of you have called somebody on the phone, and when they pick it up, they say, wow, I was just thinking of you? Or maybe you're thinking about your brother or cousin or somebody you haven't talked to for several months, for a long time. You're thinking about them, and all of a sudden, within a day or so, they call you. How many has that happened to? It's happened to me. It's happened to a lot of people. It's a very common occurrence. I'll give you one little story. A couple of years ago, I had a young man in prison taking our correspondence courses. I had worked with him for about 2 years, and I believe it was 2008, January of 2008, that he got out on parole. And he did call me when he got home. Said, hey, how are you doing, Mr. Bruce? I'm doing fine. And I wished him well, and that was it. I think I got a little note from him thanking me for working with him about a few weeks later. But after February, I didn't hear from the guy. I didn't think of him. I didn't send him anything. He didn't call me. Okay, it's now May or late May or early June. I'm cleaning out some files, and I see all his old correspondence. His name was Roderick, and I said, Roderick's out. Geez, I wonder what's happening to Roderick. I wonder if he's got a job. I wonder how he's doing. And so I put that into the closed file. That was a Friday. I was at work. That was a Friday. Again, I hadn't thought of this guy for several months. Guess what? I come into work on Monday. I look at my phone. Boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. There's a message there. Pick it up. You know who it's from. It was from Roderick. Mr. Bruce, I got a job. I'm doing laying carpet or whatever. I don't know. He might have called on Saturday or Sunday or maybe even Friday night. That's amazing. Some of you have probably had things like that happen too. Well, one of the things Sheldrake does is he makes phone surveys. Now, he called people in the USA and England, and according to his survey, about half the people indicated that at some time when they picked up the phone, they knew who it was. Not looking at caller ID, they just sensed, it's mother, it's my husband. And many people have had the experience that I described before. They call somebody and the person picking up the phone says, whoa, I was just thinking of you, wow. England, 65% of the people said they had that experience. I was just thinking of you. Go figure, in California, 78%. Tells you something about California, I guess. Now here's another interesting thing, maybe not surprising, but more women than men have had these experiences. Does that say women are more intuitive? Perhaps. Or maybe men just don't like to talk about these things, you know. They don't want to tell the pollster. Well, as with the dogs in the human relationship, ESP of this type works very well when people have an emotional bond, when they know each other very well. All right, here's an experiment that you can do. This is using the telephone. Now, this is the one I alluded to. You could have a Theosophical study group get together and do this. And he describes this in the book, the sense of being stared at, if you want to go back and read the instructions. I'm going to quote from the book here just to get it right. In these experiments, subjects received a phone call at a specified time from one of 4 different callers. The subjects knew who the potential callers were, but they did not know which one would be calling, because the caller was picked at random by the experimenter. The subject had to guess who the caller was before picking up the phone. Now, again, just going on pure chance, you got 4 participants, they'd be right just by guessing 1 out of 4, 25% of the time. I'll give you the actual results in a few minutes. Now, if you want to do this test, you need to get a few people. You pick a subject, and you ask that subject, you pick 4 people that you know that you think might be receptive telepathically to you. You know, people like your brother, your sister, your mother, your husband, that type of thing. Again, you can't use phones with caller IDs. That would give it away, of course. Now, the subject, you leave it up to that person because he has to set a time with his 4 friends. Say, okay, we're going to do this at such and such time. And then he tells the experimenter. So let's say 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon. We're going to run this experiment. 2 to 2:30, somewhere in that time frame, somebody's going to make a call. All right, at about 5 minutes before 2, Sheldrake or whoever's running the experiment at random picks one of the 4 people. Mary, okay. Mary's going to make the phone call to the subject. Now, the subject doesn't know this. Only Mary and the experimenter know. But what you do is you instruct the person making the call. You say, for about 2 minutes before you make that phone call, I want you to close your eyes and you visualize this person. I want you to concentrate on nothing else but that person, and then make the phone call. The subject hears the phone ring, and the way Sheldrake did it was set up a camera with time code there so they could verify the time. But you can do it with a person actually watching, you know, the person, to make sure that they, it's mother or whatever, before they pick the phone up. So there's different ways to do that. Now, you will say, again, you might pick a specific time, 2:15, within that half-hour time frame, and you tell the person at 2:13, 2 minutes prior, I want you to think of the person you're calling. The person getting the call doesn't know what time, it just has to sit there for the half hour, and then you measure it. And you do that over. You don't just do it once or twice. You do that 10 or 12 or 25 times. And you could do it over a period of months. You don't have to do it all at once. Okay, again, if the subjects are not receptive telepathically, and some people aren't, you at least got 1 out of 4 chances of being right, 25%. That's the norm. That's the threshold. You know, if you do less than that, you're something wrong there. And in fact, many subjects did score only at chance level. Now, many more did score considerably higher than 25%. Sheldrake ran 850 tests. It involved 65 different subjects, and they averaged 42%. Keep in mind, that's the average, including the people that only got 25%. So that means some people scored higher than 42, as high as maybe 50 or 60%. Now that's really more exciting, I think, than the stuffy experiments that J.B. Rhine did at Duke University. Just to show you the odds, 850 tests, 65 subjects, 42% accuracy. Sheldrake calculated the odds of this, and I'm going to quote him. He said, this is, quote, astronomically significant, with odds against chance being 10 to the 26th power to 1, end quote. Whew, 10 to the 26th power, wow. You know, I had to figure this out. A million, just 1 million, 1 followed by 6 zeros, that's 10 to the 6th power. You know what a trillion is? It's a pretty big number, although the way the government's spending, it's becoming more common. A trillion is 10 to the 10th power. Now, 10 to the 26th power, I don't even know if we have a word for that. In fact, I don't think I want to know. One other observation, when these phone tests are done, distance makes no difference. The subject and caller can be a mile away, 5 miles, 100 miles, makes no difference. They even had one test, 3 of the callers were around London, and one, a brother or a family member living in Australia, called from Australia. Makes no difference. Now you can do the same thing. This is a variation. You can do the same thing using email. Again, you have one subject. The subject chooses 4 friends. The researcher at random picks one of those people to send the email at a specified time. The difference is here when the subject, or rather when the emailer sends the email, he or she will copy Sheldrake or the experimenter, so he has a record of it, because emails they're coded for time. And the other difference is that the subject doesn't hear a phone ring, so there has to be somebody there observing, either that or a camera. And if it's a camera, the subject says, knowing the specified time of the email, I think it's going to be Joe sending the email. Could be right or wrong. And so again, you could have a 1 out of 4 chance of being right. Well, he did, of the email experiments, he did 160, not quite as many. 67 subjects, again, 43% ratio. Very close to the phone test, 42, 43. Ladies and gentlemen, something is going on there. It's not a statistical anomaly. There is definitely something going on there. All right. At this point, I think I may be in danger of violating the cardinal rule of Walt Disney to always leave them wanting more. So I'm going to try to wrap it up and get out while the getting's good. Let me wrap it up here with a little summary. Sheldrake says basically that much remains to be discovered in PSI, or paranormal research. We've barely scratched the surface. The obstacle is that in the scientific community, there are powerful ingrained prejudices that still exist. Yes, prejudices. Sadly, scientists who publish data supportive of ESP are often ostracized, or they risk slowing down or damaging their career. But an open-minded and objective review of the data suggests that, according to Sheldrake, our minds are not confined to the physical brain, but they extend outward like a field. We're familiar with fields, field of a magnet. Anybody that has a cell phone, the cell phone is operating within a field of certain frequency range. Now, Sheldrake has gone out to the public to try to make his case over the last, probably since the 90s. For the first 10, 15 years, he really tried hard to get the attention of people in the scientific community. Very few of that. Most of them, at least officially on the record, they won't come out and support what he's doing. Maybe they're afraid for their jobs. But so somewhere around the early 90s, Sheldrake says, you know what, I'm going to take this to the general public and explain it to them. And that's what he's doing. He's designing experiments like this that anybody can understand. And he puts forth a hypothesis which explains this behavior. He calls it Morphic Fields. And you're familiar with the idea of fields. Theosophy, theosophical literature talks about mental fields, the astral field, etc. And our minds somehow take part and operate within this greater field. So, according to this hypothesis that Sheldrake has put forth, subjects and objects are not radically separated as in the old Newtonian model of the world. They are, in fact, interlinked at some deeper level. And therefore, the data that has been gathered over the past 30 years, not only by Sheldrake, but by others, primarily by Sheldrake, I believe, the data would suggest that we are all interconnected at some deeper level, both with the environment and with the rest of humanity. Thank you. We'll take a few questions, and Steve in the back, the man with a striped shirt, he does have a microphone, and I'd like you to raise your hand, wait for the microphone, because otherwise the people watching this via webcast cannot hear the question. Gentleman in the back.
Hi. I don't know if this would be a good question for you, but is there any scientific evidence or implications of these fields of the brain being interfered now with the modern use of wireless telephones, wireless networks, and stuff like that?
Wireless telephones, do they interfere? It's a little off the topic of paranormal research. That's more of a scientific question, but I'm not kidding. Funny you mentioned that, because a few hours ago I was looking at a email I get from a Dr. Mercola, and he sends out things related to health. And one of the articles was, actually it was a video by a young lady, a researcher in Canada, talking about the danger, the electromagnetic fields emitted by cell phones. But that's about, she says they have evidence that these things are causing brain tumors. But that gets into more of a medical question, and that's about all I know of it. Any other questions? They should. But as I'm sure you realize that the cell phone industry is a billion-dollar industry. There's a lot of vested interest that will fight that kind of research. Yes, sir.
Has Sheldrake posited any explanations for how the dogs are able to sense, or the birds are able to sense, or how we are able to perhaps sense someone calling us?
Has Sheldrake come up with any explanation that would explain the behavior of dogs, cats, etc., birds? Only in a general hypothesis that these morphic fields exist. It's a hypothesis, and that part of their being, their mind, is tapped into that somehow. I don't believe I've run across more precise explanations than that. So it's basically this general theory that morphic fields exist, very similar to what you find in Theosophy, with some differences. Another question? Right there.
I cannot help but respond to that, because I have read some of Rupert Sheldrake's information, and he has said that morphic fields, which he describes, are about as close to what Akasha is in the Theosophical writings, like a universal field of interconnection of all beings, and that we are all connected in this level, and that Akasha exists both at the emotional level and the mental level, and that would explain why the emotional connection makes it work more clearly.
Wow. So it sounds like he's at least familiar with theosophical literature. Gentleman back there, Tommy.
So what is the Bruce explanation of what's going on?
The Bruce explanation, I'm not a scientist, so I'm just a layman like you. And I would say that Sheldrake is definitely onto something. He calls it morphic fields. From my many years of studying theosophy, I would also add to that, when we're thinking of somebody, it's not only the field, but we're actually creating, as Charles Leadbeater in many of his books talks about, thought forms. It's distinct bundles of energy that if you're clairvoyant at the higher planes, you can actually see these, they take shape on the mental plane. And these can actually be projected from the person. That's not, that's just from my readings. That's not scientific. Leadbeater was not a scientist, but he was a very good observer. And that's part of what science is all about, observing accurately. Yes, sir.
Dr. Sheldrake visited here, 10, 15 years ago.
He
Has it
did.
been that long? I know at least once, and I
Yes.
can't say any more.
Pardon me, anybody, Betty, when was that, 2002, 2003?
Yeah, he was here in 1985 and then again in
1985 and 2002 or thereabouts. We have some of his videos from, I believe he spoke at the Kern lecture downtown Chicago. So I'm sorry, sir, continue with your question.
And he then called these morphogenic fields.
Morphogenetic fields, yes. Mhm.
Genetic, or genic, I think. Genetic.
I'm not sure what the subtle difference is, but on his website now he refers to morphic fields generally. He has quite a few books out. You might want to read A New Science of Life. I think that was published. It's one of the early books that he came out with, and that gets into more describing the fields. Back row, gentlemen.
Are you familiar with the movie The Living Matrix?
I haven't seen that movie, no.
It's a nice DVD, about an hour and a half long, and it goes into the morphogenetic
The
fields.
Living Matrix?
Yeah.
It's a DVD. How long is it?
About maybe an hour and a half.
Hour and a half. Is that a documentary?
It's somewhat along those lines.
You could
yes.
probably get it on Netflix, right? Or-
It's more metaphysics.
Oh,
Much more
okay.
metaphysics. So you
Now,
really actually have to understand.
Does that relate to this subject? It
pretty
does.
much, yes.
The Living Matrix. Okay.
I've seen it a couple times. I actually bought it on Amazon because I was so fascinated by
All
it.
right.
But just some of it goes right over my head. Some of it I
Maybe-
really understood.
Some of you might want to check that out then. Any other questions? Just about tapped out here. Remember what Walt Disney said. All right. Very good. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.